Future of talk is here. Power 102 Digital.
Indeed, it's right here at Power 102 Digital Monday, and we're going to start Hard Talk ASAP. Our special hosts are Karen Nunez Tesheira and Dennise Demming. And of course, we have a special guest in the form of Dr. Sunil Lalu. Good afternoon, Karen. Do your personal introduction. Hard Talk starts now.
Right. Well, good evening to everyone. And I'm saying good evening because I know I'm not in my usual setting. And yes, I'm all the way in good old England. But my commitment to Hard Talk, to the station, and to you, the audience, has made me, it's late. It's actually past my bedtime here, to be very honest. But in any event, I have a great commitment to the program. I have a great commitment to 102 FM because I think this program has attempted to try to inform persons and do a deeper dive into issues. And we still want you to do what we take a tape at the end for you to participate. Dennise is with us as my co-host. She hasn't joined us as yet. But in the interim, as we wait for her to join us, always David McIntyre. I mean, I couldn't tell you straight up. I rely very heavily on David, as he knows. He is my point person. Even all the way up here, he gets these calls from me. But we have today with us, and very lucky and very happy and very, very pleased. I didn't realize, Dr. Lalu, you were such a young man. Because I'm not so young myself anymore. I have to say that when I did see your picture on UE, when I looked you up on the UE website, I said, but this is a very young person. But in any event, let me, I will ask you, I have your information. I will ask you if you would like to tell us a little bit about yourself, and where you don't say all that I have on the bio on you, I wanted to ask you a little bit more of a deep dive into knowing what kind of surveyor you are, because this is why the program today, I should have said from the very get-go, is I know the property tax has been on the, well, it has been in news cycle for a number of weeks. And I thought, well, I am the Miss Tesheira, they used to call me, and take it all in good spirits. This is Trinidad. And the point is that I think that we have not on this show really explored the property tax legislation, all the various pieces of legislation. Very important evaluation part. I don't think many people may not recognize the importance of evaluation, and whether we can look at other ways in which the government can look for revenue, and whether going the way of, and this is not Dr. Lalu's point, that would be my point, and perhaps Dennise's point, and he made, I don't know what his views are, think that perhaps we can look at alternatives to the residential for various reasons. But I don't want to go into that too much. I want first to have Dr. Sunil Lalu. I hope I can call you Sunil. You could
yes, of course. Sunil is fine.
Yeah, you're so young. I'm going to call you Sunil anyhow. But you all who listening is Dr. Lalu, eh? But so Sunil, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you don't, and tell us about what a valuator is, because I know there are different categories and what category you fall into.
Yeah. So I'm a lecturer at the University of the West Indies. I teach in the Department of Geomatics Engineering and Land Management. I just want to say that this year we are celebrating our 40th anniversary, providing education in surveying predominantly, but also in things like urban planning and geographical information systems. So we have a whole host of events for our 40th anniversary. I'm also a member of the Institute of Surveyors of Trinidad and Tobago, and a part-time consultant with G.A. Farrell and Associates Limited. So in the English system, there are different types of surveyors. Surveyors are persons who are experts on measurement. So what we in Trinidad would call a surveyor usually refers to a land surveyor. They are the persons who measure property boundaries. But there are many types of surveyors, and I'm a valuation surveyor. So valuation surveyors advise on property value, rental value, how property can transact on the open market, leases for residences, commercial leases, and that sort of thing. And you also have quantity surveyors who advise on construction costs
Yes.
and project management and construction contracts. And we also have a new emerging field. Well, it's not new, but it's emerging in Trinidad and Tobago called building surveyors. Building surveyors are very closely related to quantity surveyors in that they are also experienced in construction. Their expertise deals with building defects. So they would go into a building and assess whether there are any cracks or any other types of defects in the building and how it will be rectified and the cost of it. So these are the different branches of surveying under the Institute of Surveyors. I was a former president of the ISTT under the valuation surveying banner, right? Because the presidency rotates among the different factions. So in terms of my own practice, I have been practicing predominantly in commercial valuations and things like valuations of gas stations, hotels, commercial office buildings, malls, and that sort of stuff.
And you did not mention that you are a fellow of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors.
Ah,
Am I
yes,
right?
yes,
Yes, can't forget that. And I want you did mention the quantity surveyors, which when Permon is building, I understand, and that's very helpful in a way if you have the have a quantity surveyor because contractors are known to somehow the price is never what they tell you it is, and it's never this way. It's always up.
yeah,
And so it's good to get up. So I know that quantity surveyors play an important part. If you're building, definitely land surveying. Obviously, that's where you have so many boundary disputes.
mhm,
And if you're going to sell, you've got to decide, you've got to be able to determine your boundaries. And so that's an important part of the surveying profession.
yeah,
But you are here more to help us with the valuation component because
yeah,
this is where the property tax comes in, and that's where the valuation division of the Ministry of Finance, with which I know you do. My understanding is at least you have done some sort of um, not a retainer but consultancy, so you are very familiar, I believe, with the valuation division and how it operates. And this is one of the reasons we've asked you to come on. I noticed just as I'm saying this, there's something called geomatic land surveying, which apparently is one of the formed because this is the division that you belong to. And the reason
yeah.
I mention it especially, and you can correct me before we go on to more details about property tax and how it emerged, and I'm going to give you the floor to tell us more about the valuation division.
So I
Because
have not worked with the valuation division, but UE, my department at UE, was hired to train the assessors. Right, the assessors are the field agents who go out and collect data on the property, physical data on properties, and that part of that process is involved in computing annual rental value. So we train them here at UE, and I was involved in that training. I taught the property law aspect of it, right? Interesting. I didn't teach the valuation aspect of it. Um, yeah. So we've had other persons as well. Retired commissioner of valuations taught the valuation part of it. So
what you were
yeah.
doing was assessing, you were training them to do what?
So the assessors, the state has valuers, valuation surveyors, and property tax assessors. So the valuation surveyors are full professionals. They would have had a degree and training and professional membership with the ISTT and that sort of stuff. So they are the ones who really coordinate and determine rates and that sort of stuff. But you have the foot soldiers, who I would like to call them, who are the property tax assessors. There were about 400 of them.
So what do you do with them? I know of it, but I just want to hear it from you because I want to get some clarification. So when they go out there and do the property thing and you have trained them, what do you do with the information they come back with then?
So, well, not me. I don't. I'm not
Not you.
employed.
I mean, what does the valuation division do with it if they're going out there, having been trained to do assessment of properties,
Yeah.
when they do it, having been trained what to look for, etc., etc. When they have done that and they come back with information, since they are not values, what is done with that information?
Well, that is mainly input data. So there's some data that we need in order to compute valuations. So such information such as building size, building condition, and that sort of thing. They would collect that data. So they would be trained on how to measure buildings, how to categorize buildings based on different tiers that were set up. So there are tiers such as standard residential 1, standard residential 2, modern executive, and that sort of stuff. So they were trained on how to be able to categorize properties in those broad categories and also measure building areas. And those are the two main input factors in working out what the annual rental value of a property would be.
Right. It's also we're going a little ahead of ourselves on that because what you're saying, when I say I don't mean that you are,
Mhm.
but I meant what I probably wanted to say was this is that well, I mean, I pass the Property Tax Act, yes,
Mhm.
and I'm not distancing myself from it at all. And what we did do, we did exactly what you're saying that you're doing now. So this is not you. This is when in 2009, 2008, what we were doing in December 2009, we passed that law. And why we were able to do it and felt that we could have enough information. Dennise is joining us. Dennise, we started. Hi, how are you? I
Uh,
just just getting information from Dr. Lalu, who I said, I think I'm old enough to call him Sunil, and he's young enough for me to call him Sunil. But no, and of course, you too, but the people who call it, no, it's Dr. Lalu, please. But what he was saying to me is this is what concerns me. And this is not um, directed at you, Sunil or Dr. Lalu, is that that's exactly what we did. In order, we decided that we were going to do residential first,
Mhm.
and I have the text, I have the actually have the thing that was given to me as my guide, and we would send them out, and we would tell them to look at for the data land characteristics, whether executive, modern, standard, substandard, or shack. They were told to look at floor area of the building, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, utilities available, and rent. And if you're using it for rental value, either they would tell you what it is, or you would be able to, based on they said you shouldn't use location, but based on all the factors, be able to determine the rental value. So I want to ask you, Dennise, if you don't mind me, just as I started the conversation with him, um, when they went out there to do the assessment, which they did when I was there. This is when that's exactly what they did, and that's exactly why we felt comfortable that we were ready to send out bills. We were ready to send out bills. But what is the purpose of the return? That's what I don't know, because I know both in the Land and Building Act, which was repealed, but came into force many years ago, but was repealed when this act, the Property Tax Act, was passed. But also even under the Valuation Act, it provides still for the occupier or owner of a property to provide a return.
Yep.
And return. So is that a duplication? Because what are they supposed to be give? What's that return supposed to? What
So you see,
information?
there was an issue with the return. The original return under the Act, I believe it was Section 6, had given
Yeah.
a deadline of, if I remember well, April something of a specific year. I think it was 2010.
Yeah.
So that subsection, from my recollection, was never repealed, and so it was a stalemate to really enforce that return. And that return was a very simple one. It just asked property owners to identify who is the owner, where it is located, if it was rented or not, and also to do what you call a self-assessment. So a property owner could say, I think my property could rent for X dollars, right? So it had a self-assessment part of it. But because of the fact, and that
So
actually
what
was
is
what.
the purpose then? I guess what I'm asking
Mhm.
really is if you're going to, if the valuation division is the one to do the valuation,
Yeah.
if the valuation division is the one that has trained people, when I was there, we did it, and now you're saying, but you all have done it, to look at certain things. What is the purpose of the return? Because it's not sounds like redundancy. I mean, I
No,
don't understand the purpose of it. That's what I'm trying. I asked Dennise, we were talking about it, and I
yeah.
said I would ask you, what is the purpose of the return then?
Well, the return gives property owners the ability to provide data in advance. So you can think about it in the same way that you have VAT returns, income tax returns, where the taxpayer has the opportunity to advise the state on their assets and what they owe, right? As opposed to the state collecting that data themselves. So it's a way for the population to advance information and speed along the process. So if you were to see, there were in the recent assessments, um, many properties were not visited. So they
Right,
relied solely on the returns that were filed
right,
and probably some aerial view or some curbside view of the properties
right.
and ran with it.
Here's a question that I want to ask.
Yeah.
If that is the case, how is it that neighboring properties are significantly different?
Well, I would love to know that myself because you see, and I'm just
I mean, not putting you on the spot,
Yeah.
just understand that it is really about, listen, we have listeners who want to understand, and we feel that we want to take the opportunity as best as we can to use any expertise. And I think the expertise that we need is the expertise from someone who's familiar with the valuation, the work of value, because that really is the key to this whole thing. And many people may not recognize not the percentage so much. Yes, the percentage is something that the government decides on for fiscal purposes, for revenue collecting purposes. But before they can apply whatever percentage they decide to apply, they've got to have evaluation. So, it is in the act. It's nothing that they did. It's in the land and building from 1940 or 1948 or 19 whatever. It is in the Municipal Corporation Act. So it is an evaluation act. So it is not something, what I'm trying to say is it's not something that they surreptitiously put into the legislation. So that is why I asked the question. You answered me in a way. You said with the income tax, you provide the state with your income tax return, and you take the risk that they decide they'll call you in because something not, as I say, the math's not mathsing, and they call you in or they do a thing, and then you get called in.
Yeah.
So it seems to me this is what I'm not probably putting the cart before the horse. But I wanted to get this out of the way because what I don't understand, and you have said it, what's the purpose of the return? It seems to me you're doing, why not take the same approach? And I'm not criticizing the government. I had it was there when I was in office. It was there under the Land and Building Act. It's been there. It's not anything new. And I'm sure if I went back to the British legislation, that's where we got it.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering what is the purpose of it if you are going to send out people to train them to do the evaluation. Because it does, if you give a valuation, if you do a return and they say that you do not tell the truth, you're not credible, you are liable to a significant fine or penalty. So it's
That's
not
good.
just
Yeah.
a simple thing of giving them information. I said, okay, the information not right, so we'll ignore the information. It's a point of, if you give me that information and that information is wrong, there is a penalty attached to it. So I can't understand the thinking. I'm trying to understand the thinking. This is not to do with any government. I'm trying to understand the thinking behind evaluation, that you would have a return provision. You would send out people to do the evaluation, train them, and then you have the valuation rule, or used to be called the assessment rule.
Yeah.
What is the point of the return?
I think it was really, and I'm just speculating here because I can't speak
Right.
for the ministry, but I think it was just really to expedite the process. Because if you had to have the assessors go and do an individual evaluation of every property, then it would never happen at that rate.
Well, no, it never would.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing, Okay, so I kind of started in the cart before the horse, and I see I've lost Dennise. I don't know where Dennise has disappeared to. I hope she'll join us back soon. But what I really wanted to explore, and the people to understand and ask you, because you are a evaluator and you would, if you were involved in the training, um, what is the thinking? I mean, I can answer some of these questions myself, but I like an independent voice, to say their own independent view. What is the purpose of the property tax? Whether there are four categories: there's residential, there's agricultural, there's industrial, and there's commercial.
Yeah.
And so those are the four categories. And there are different methodologies that can be applied depending if it's agricultural and if it is industrial, but it's the same methodology of calculating the taxable value for both um, residential and commercial. So, what is the purpose today of what do you see as the purpose of the property tax? Because I looked at the legislation to see if it would tell me what is the purpose of collecting the property tax. Maybe it's obvious it's a tax, obviously, but it doesn't specifically say it is for local government. It doesn't
Well,
specifically say a particular objective. So what is the purpose of the property tax?
Well, property tax, if you were to look at the original Habitat Convention where it was discussed, it is a way for the state to recapture an unearned increment from property value as a result of state intervention. So, for example, when the state goes and does some development work like pave roads, put in infrastructure, or any sort of investment in communities, it causes a direct impact on a direct appreciation in the value of private property. And that is an appreciation that private property owners didn't do anything to earn that. So persons were just, to put it in a very um, blunt way, it's as if persons got an incremental increase in their value that they did not earn. And so property tax is a mechanism by which the state recaptures part of that value. So the state would have had interventions, physical interventions in communities, which resulted in the increase in private property values. And so property tax is a mechanism to recapture, for the state to recapture part of that value. The problem, of course, is that the increase in value in properties is an increase in equity. It's not a liquid increase. It's not like persons are getting money in their hand and they just have to hand over part of
Value
it.
of their property goes up, so the
Yeah.
equity goes up.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's more than that. I mean, it's part of the local government service, right? Because as far as I understand it, is to use property tax because roads have to be maintained, public
Well,
highways.
it's meant to feed into a virtuous cycle. So the
Okay.
virtuous cycle being that the state improves the community, property values increase, property owners pay property tax, that money goes back into improving the community, and it just goes in a progressive cycle like that, whereby the community is always maintained to a good standard. So it's
Right.
meant to create a virtuous cycle.
Right. But you put it in a very, okay, let me just put it this way. I do accept the argument that when communities, roads and ditches and their waterways and their bridges, et cetera, are maintained at a certain standard, you benefit. You benefit, you get equity in your property, and therefore this is a form of tax that the government in any country, many countries, most countries implement. But it's also a way of ensuring that if you that standards of hygiene, public hygiene are maintained,
Public
the
health and safety. Yeah.
and health and safety, and bridges are maintained. So it's not just a matter of increasing my value, it's a question of when a bridge breaks down, who's going to fix the those bridges if they're public bridges, the public roadways, not highways, but public roadways, the marketplaces, the cemeteries, and the dogs, and the litter and all that sort of thing. So it goes beyond creating equity to a point of ensuring that you do not allow a community who's where you are talking about public spaces, not my private home, but public spaces, that the revenue from the country is used in order to maintain a certain standard in the
Yeah.
community, so the roads have potholes, that the ditches are not full of filth and dirt and debris, that you don't have flooding and so on. So there are two sides of the coin. It's not one side.
There's also criticism with that theory in that it exacerbates regional economic disparities in the sense that a low income community would have low property values and so low property taxes and therefore less money to improve the community, and that therefore feeds into a vicious cycle that they stay in that low income state, whereas a high income community has high property values, so high property tax, so a high level of community improvement, and it just keeps going around. And that way, yeah, high income gets higher and low income gets lower. So
Okay,
just
so I have the answer for you for that.
yes.
The answer to that is, of course, when I say I have the answer to that is, that is a good argument, and that is a reasonable argument, and that is a valid argument, and you see it all over the world. Why you go into certain neighborhoods and the rubbish is not collected, the place is run down and so on, because they say, well, this community, they're not paying taxes, or the taxes are low and the cost of maintaining is high, and they don't. But we don't have a system like that, because one of the things, again, I speak for when I was in government and up to now, the local government legislation has not been implemented. So until it is implemented, the status quo remains the same. And that was, at the time, the question was, should the property tax not be given to the regional corporations because in fact, and the boroughs and so on, so that they can use the taxes collected, it was residential properties only, so for the exact purposes of maintaining the roadways, doing all the things of maintenance, of bridges, etc., that was required. And one of the things that the fight back against that was, no, put it in the consolidated fund. And well, listeners, just to let you know, when you put it in this consolidated fund, that means everything goes inside of there. So you don't know, there's no separation of the money that you collected for property tax, because it's all into that same pot. However, the legislation, which is in the local government legislation, which is yet to be proclaimed, what it says is, and what it says is, we will let the boroughs and regional corporations collect the residential tax only, and to the extent that they fall short of the needs, the additional monies will be provided from the consolidated fund. So it will not be a case where it's a poor neighborhood. And secondly, I want to add to that, and let me ask you your point of view on this, because in a way, you have said correctly so that there are certain communities, they're poor communities. So the poor communities, obviously, usually they are rural communities, and usually in rural communities, you're not going to get the wear and tear on roads. Mm-hmm. You might get a lot of flooding. You might get a lot of other issues. But it seems to me that if the purpose of the tax is to be able to maintain communities and to be able to maintain them at a certain standard, and the fact is that the rural communities generally will not usually have collect enough taxes, why not start with the commercial properties, which we had under the Municipal Corporation Act with the house rates? Why are we not starting with them? I'm just asking your opinion, if you have an opinion on it.
Well, I would say that many communities do not have that much commercial property. So if the government, right, I need to stop saying we, if the state were to collect only commercial property tax, then you would have a high amount of taxes being collected for the municipalities and a very low level of revenue being collected in residential communities. And so if we were to use the argument that the money should go in the same communities where they're collected, then we will see Port of Spain and San Fernando being developed and rural communities not. So the revenue will only come from certain commercial districts, not from throughout the country. We have residences throughout the country. So the revenue base would be...
Say to that, Dennise.
Can I jump in? I'm sorry, I'm having internet issues, so it's just dropping off. So I can only do it.
And I'm the one not in the country, huh?
Out of the country, and I am in the country, and it's just dropping off. So it's a little bit frustrating. But here's my question about the commercial, focusing on the commercial before you focus on the residential. I fully understand what you just said, that there would be a lot of inequity because a lot of communities do not have commercial residences. But my thought is that we have not worked out an acceptable manner for all of the residences. It's easier to work with the commercial ones and do the commercial first, and let's continue to work through how residential taxes can be paid. How does that sound to you?
I think it is absolutely easier. And in other words, you're absolutely correct. From a valuation standpoint, it's a lot easier to arrive at a rental value for a commercial space than it is for a residential space. So it would be procedurally a lot easier, I could say that. As to why the state decided to go with residential first and completely disregard commercial, I don't know. But even mixed use properties are not being considered in this rollout. So people who live upstairs of, let's say, a supermarket, that those properties are not being considered in this rollout.
Dennise, you have something more to say?
When you say they're not being considered in this rollout, they're not going to be taxed?
Correct.
You know, that information is so important for the public, because the people who own residences are already having challenges. They don't understand what is happening. They think some of it is unfair. And now you're telling me that where you have mixed properties, so you have a property in which there's a commercial space as well as a residential space, they are not even being considered. That just adds inequity, doesn't it?
It's not part of the rollout.
We don't want to put you on the spot, Dr. Lalu, because that's not the purpose of your intervention here at all.
It's not part of the role. It's not part of the rollout at all.
Okay, and I will tell you something. I am the one. I will tell you why I have real difficulty with what is going on right now. And I have spoken to Dennise. Dennise can jump in. You can say what you think about this. When we look at, you said a commercial is easier to do. You know, when we say, first of all, when they talk about commercial, and they talk about the commercial properties, many of those commercial properties are owned by a small segment of this population in this country, because most of them will be either in the cities or in the towns. A small segment of the population in this country. And if I were there, I would be very happy that the government decides, because listen, 2009 is not 2024. I'm sure you may have seen it. This is not me, the central bank, saying that people live in paycheck to paycheck. It's not me that's showing the state of the economy, which we are not here to talk about. But certainly the economy for many people, and many people who were considered middle class, the cost of living, etc., it's a different ball game today than it was years ago. Because when we had brought it out, contrary to what was said by even persons in our own government, that it was an attempt to raise revenue, the view was we needed to reform the system by computerizing it. But we knew that in the end, we would have gotten most of everyone on that assessment or valuation rule. Why? Because we may not have caught you in the first round, but we are still going to send out these young people or persons who had been trained to do the valuations, and the neighbors would come and toil on you. You would read legislation and see that they have a penalty if you don't come in and declare your property. And that we were confident that as time went on, that valuation role would become such that we would get most of the property, but we had to have a starting point. And we felt that we had a good enough starting point, because at the time, I think we had about 250,000 and we were ready to rule it out. But things have changed. And I would just say this one thing, and then I will let you and Dennise take over. And you may call me a cynic. And this is a cynic, but I feel a responsibility to the public. And this is why I am saying it. I think there are people who are very happy very, very, very happy that the government is concentrated on residential property, because under the former Municipal Corporation Act, which I know you must be familiar with, Dr. Lalu, you know there's something called house rates. And when they said house rates, they wouldn't just talk about dwelling houses. They would talk about factories, shops, stores, anything you lease it out to the government. The whole of Port of Spain is nearly owned by private enterprise and lease it to the government, right? So when you look at the big cities, Sanford and all these big cities, a lot of the buildings are rented out by the government, privately owned. A lot of the shops are owned privately. And it seems to me something is wrong where they may not live, a large part of our population, they don't live in the city, but they certainly go in the city 5 days a week because they work in the city. They use the roads in the city. They use the pavements in the city. They use the water in the city. They use the marketplace in the city. That's where you get usage, because most people live in bedroom communities. Because by the time they reach home at 6 o'clock, they ain't going away, right? So they are very happy. They are very happy. And I am very concerned that this government, if it says it wants to raise money and it's easier to do the commercial properties, and cities and boroughs are where all the rentals are taking place and are owned by private enterprise, they are quite happy you're going after residential, because most of them may find themselves living outside of those cities and boroughs, and therefore not subject to what used to be called house rates. So in my view, this is my view, that at this point in time, if you are talking about collecting revenue and you want to talk about equity and you want to talk about fair play, you go after the commercial properties. And because that's where the population goes into every single 5 days a week. They can't get parking. They have to pay for parking. The roads are in a mess. The holes in it. This is where you need the money to be spent. Go after them and then go after residential. There are a lot of people happy that you're going after. A lot of the TTMA say that they're happy. They're happy with the residential. I would be happy if I were there too. I would be happy if I was them too. And if I was in downtown, if I was in Port or San Fernando, I'm glad you're going after residential too. So something is wrong in my view at this point in time, that the government, if it is about revenue collection, that the focus is not being put on the commercial. Now, I don't know what your views are. I'm giving Dennise and you to take over my piece.
I think we addressed this just a little earlier, talking about that it would be easier to even collect taxes from commercial organizations and from residential. But Karen, you said something that and it's not my area. I'm a communications person, that I'm just curious about. What is a bedroom community?
A bedroom community is people who work in town. By the time they reach home at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, so they call it. It's in America too. They use that terminology. Maybe I got that terminology from an Americanism, which say that a lot of communities in America are bedroom communities, because by the time the persons, they work outside of where their residence is. They live in suburban areas, like in Trinidad, but they work in the cities and the towns. So by the time they come home in the afternoon, they've gone home to sleep. Am I right, Chanel?
Yeah.
Okay, so you
speaks to people not having the opportunity to even have a good life in their own, wherever they live. Because if all they're doing is leaving at 6 and coming back at 6, then they're just sleeping there and they don't have a chance to even develop any lifestyle. How do you bring up your children in circumstances like that?
To make potholes in the road. You could flood though. Make potholes in the road, or get all those stray dogs, all the money these corporations. By the way, before you say anything, let me just say, the reason why I knew that they were against the giving it to the local government is the same reason Thatcher did. No, I am not agreeing with Thatcher, because her poll tax, which came up to be like a poll tax, it brought down her government. She lost power over that and brought in John Major over her former tax. But what was her inspiration, for want of a better word, was the fact that she felt that the opposition party and even within her own party were corrupt. And instead of using the funds collected from the from the county councils and the different areas, were being abused and misused. And so the feeling was at my time was that they didn't want to put it in their hands because of that same fear of corruption that she had. So put it in the consolidated fund and we'll dole it out. So I just wanted to make that point why they and that to the extent to which the corporate the entity or the area needs funding, we will give you funding. We'll give you the funding from the consolidated fund. But Dr. Lalu, I want to hear your views about the commercial versus the residential, or if you have any view on it at all.
Well, you see, I'm having a concern, and I think this view is expressed by many other professionals in the area, and that is there isn't much information in the public domain as to how the assessments are done. So we have very skeletal information, and as Dennise was saying earlier, how is it that somebody can have an assessment that is vastly different from a neighbor who might have a very similar property? So we do not have very comprehensive, very clear information in the public domain as to how the assessments are being done. I can speculate based on little bits of information that we've heard that it seems to me that it's a value banded system. So a value banded system is where they would place properties in broad categories, like how you had shack, single family residential 1, residential 2, modern and executive. And then they would have in a matrix on a table going across, there would be different value bands. So value band A could be a very high income neighborhood. Value band B could be a secondary neighborhood. So if you were to take, for example, let me think of a neighborhood I actually know. Let's say Shogunas. So in Shogunas, Lanch Park could be value band A, right? Orchard Gardens could be value band B. So a modern house will rent for more in value band A than it would in value band B because of the characteristics of the community. And then to that, in each value band, under each category, there would be a rate. Let's say $1.50 per square foot, which is then multiplied by the building area. Now, that seems to me, based on little bits of information as to what it is they're doing, but we don't know because nobody ever came out and said, this is the method that we are using to value property, to assess property. Nobody ever said that. I'm just assuming based on tidbits and my understanding of valuation methodology that the value banded system is the only approach that seems to fit the little bits of knowledge that is coming out. And there are concerns with that in the sense that residential property are not rented on the basis of size. That's my criticism number one. So commercial space, which as I was saying is easy to assess a rental value, is rented on the basis of size. So in Port of Spain, for example, office space can rent for say $12 a square foot. So if you have a commercial office space that is 1,000 square feet, then it's easy to say that this is $12,000 is the annual rental value per month, right? Is the rental value per month, and that multiplied by 12 is the annual rental value. And in addition to that, commercial rental transactions are registered. So you have a verifiable source of transaction information to rely on to work out what is the rate per square foot. Residential property, when residential property are rented on the open market, only residential leases that are over 3 years are registered because they are mandatory. It's mandatory, right, under law. But the majority of residential leases are not registered. So where is this transaction data coming from? How are you arriving at, say, in Port of Spain, value band A for a modern house is $250 a square foot? How are you arriving at that if we don't have verifiable transaction activity? So, and with that in mind as well, remember many of the properties are not physically measured. So from what I've heard, again, from tidbits of information that the minister said in Parliament that we've heard through the grapevine, is that aerial imagery is being used to work out what is the building size. Now, when you look at a property from an aerial image, what you are seeing is the roof line. And many people have these large roof eaves. So your roof eave goes out sometimes as much as 3 feet or more beyond the building wall. So if you are measuring a building based on the roof line, that will be a gross overestimation of what is the building size. And not to mention if somebody has, let's say, a shed or a carport. So I have a large carport in my house that has the same type of roof as the building. So if you're looking at this from the top, from an aerial view, you will think that this is part of the building, but it's not. It's a carport or shed. So this could be one of the reasons why people are getting very, very high assessments. Okay. So again, we don't the problem is we don't know. No, the valuation division, the Ministry of Finance, nobody has come out to say this is the methodology being adopted. And I'm of the view that unless you can come out and say what is the methodology, then there may be some concern as to whether or not this can stand to scrutiny.
But Dr. Lalu, what I don't understand is that is your view, but I'm sure that is the view of the Chartered Association, is the view of surveyors, and what can be done for those views to really get to the government so that they can just reconsider what they're doing. Because what you're saying is that a lot of it, there's not enough information out there, so we don't even know how the assessment is happening.
Yep.
So what's the role of the Chartered Association, the Surveyors Association, in getting this done?
Well, the Institute of Surveyors, we have had multiple position papers on it, many of which were just ignored. I would say, but we are currently working on a position paper now on this very basis, on the lack of public information. Now, one can argue that our members are the valuers in valuation division. But the thing is, it's not a matter of us having inside information because we have these connections. We need information to be in the public domain that anybody has access to. Now, separate and apart from the methodology being adopted, it would be prudent to have the role available publicly.
That's what I was going to
So
raise.
that anybody can see. I would be able to go and see, wait, my neighbor is paying a substantially lower rate than me, and they have a much bigger house or much better accommodation. I know of cases where people are living in, these townhouse units where all of the units are almost the same thing. And one person's assessment was vastly different to their neighbor who has almost an identical townhouse. So something is wrong, and we would expect that in any assessment process there would be anomalies. You would have some errors in the system. Some properties would be overvalued, undervalued, and that's the purpose of the objection process. But it seems like the amount of anomalies is far beyond what you would what I think is a reasonable tolerance for this.
Dr. Lalu, can we just go back to something you said? You said that they are doing the assessment on the basis of aerial view. And that aerial view, so it's hopefully it's some kind of robot that's going up there and looking at it, or however they're doing it. But they're looking at it from in the air, in the sky, looking at the roofs.
Mhm.
And there's no distinction between, let's say, what is the garage and what is the house.
Correct.
So it means the number of residences could be regarded as far much larger than they are if you're just using the roof.
Yeah.
And does that happen in other countries?
No. So not that I'm aware of. But if we were to look at, let's say, in England, so in London they do a value
So
banded
that is
system.
how they're doing it.
So the value banded system that is used in London is not on the basis of rental value, it's on the basis of sale value. So they could lump properties. You would be able to easily tell a property is valued between 1 million and 2 million. Very easy to throw them into these large categories, and everybody within a value band pay the same property tax. So it's a very simple method to avoid doing very in-depth analyses and in-depth assessments, which will burden the state because it's quite costly for the state to hire assessors to do this evaluation. As a matter of fact, I would be interested to know how much the state has spent behind property tax thus far. right? I would
I'm
be
gonna,
most.
I'm gonna ask you something. Well, I have to take some responsibility for all of what you just said, by the way. But before I get answering that, and you have consultants who would give you advice, and but before I go into that, you made a point, and I think we should. I don't want us to pass it over, which is where you said that you didn't use the word, but it comes down to a lack of transparency, which gives a people a sense of they don't feel that you're not telling them how you're arriving at this. So I don't know how come X is getting this valuation that's in the same townhouse building as I am, same number of rooms, and it's vastly different. I looked at both pieces of legislation to make sure that I didn't get it wrong. And in both pieces of legislation, that is under the Land and Building Act, which was repealed because that was all the land and buildings that came out that fell outside of the boroughs,
Mhm.
the
Many
cities,
cities, yeah.
right. You use a different methodology for assessing.
Yep.
And it's in the legislation that every 15th year they would be required, it's in the Act, a 50-year published in the Gazette and in a daily newspaper for public inspection, not the names, but the streets and the numbers and everything for anybody, member of the public, and any member of the public to inspect that book, which would be put in a place for however long, so people can then look and see what the values that the taxes that were being paid. So there was a level of transparency. When I went to the Valuation Act, it said every 5 years, and every 5 years they are supposed to make. At that time, they called it the assessment rule because it was being done by the District Revenue Office. But District Revenue Office and for lands in that district. But every fifth year, they would be required, from my understanding, again, to put in a public place for
Mm.
public inspection the the book for that region or that area of the taxes paid by the properties, not by the names will not be included, but the location and how much taxes. So you yourself could say, but hey, I own a place. I'm living in that condominium and I have a 2 bedroom. How I paying this and this one pay? So you could see, so there was transparency. People have asked. I don't know if it has been answered, but where is the transparency now for persons to have the right, as they did before
Mhm.
under that legislation, to go and inspect the books to see what taxes other persons were paying so that they could get a sense of equity.
Yep.
Is that something that you all are considering? And Dennise, I don't know.
Well, I want to know what's the current status?
Yes, what is happening?
Well, I think that there's a general hesitance on the part of the state to do so because prior to this, we had, by we I mean surveyors and also real estate agents,
You better
had
correct
asked,
your being truth, huh?
had asked that the state make a public registry of all property transactions, which is a very common thing throughout the world. You can go in Miami and search a comparable database and see every house that was sold and very, very detailed information in terms of building size, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, the kitchen, photographs, and all of this, who purchased it, and all of that. So what we have now in the land registry is just title information being registered. We do not have any details that will tell you what are the characteristics of the property, including the building information. So there's a need for a publicly accessible property transaction database. And we've been making that call now for at least the last 2 decades.
Wow. So
And
just for
I
20,
want to say, in fairness to us, in fairness when we were in government, we were going to put out, that was going to be put out, that we were going to, for the transparency, that there was, maybe it was not any legislation, because I look back at the legislation and didn't see it, but we were going to have a list that anybody could go to any office, because everything was going to be computerized.
Yeah.
and that you could look and find out what was the tax that number two, Sundown Street in wherever was paying, and you know who owned number two because it was not because you own number one, right?
Karen, all you're doing is reinforcing a point that I make very often, which is that when we have changes in government, there's no continuity. And if you're saying since 2009 or whatever year that was, that you were thinking through how could we make the information transparent and available to everybody? And Dr. Lalu is now telling us that you can go to any other country and get it, go online, and you can find out the exact information you're talking about. What was the tax that my neighbor paid for the identical house that we live in? But
And even so, um, I don't want to make unfair comparisons, because comparing us to, say, the United States, where they have a much great different resource capacity, might be unfair. But let's look at Guyana, right? I don't think that Guyana is in a substantially more privileged position than us in the years gone by, and they have a publicly accessible register. It's not digital, it's not available on the web, but the books are publicly accessible. So you can go into the Guyana Revenue Authority and get the transaction data in that way. Anybody can get any transaction data in that way. So they may just need to update it in terms of technology and putting it online and all that. But the information is there and it's accessible. So
And that was the intention. Huh? That was that is what we were going to put it online, that you
but
could
Karen, you didn't.
to see
Karen,
what
you didn't. That was the intention, but you didn't.
I
So
didn't be, guess what? Guess what? You don't have to know where. Okay, so we won't go down that road. But what we had, what we did have ready, which is the point I started with Dr. Lalu, when and he could tell me the rationale. I never understood the rationale for the amendment to the Act. I think it was the Evaluation Act. That first of all, you used to have an assessment rule, but I think I understood the assessment rule, and now you have a valuation rule because the assessment is supposed to be done by the
by BIR.
BIR and evaluation is supposed to be done by the valuation division. Whereas before, under the old systems, everything was done by the district revenue by the district revenue office. But what I never could understand, maybe you can answer, is that we were of the view that we knew we did not get a lot of the properties. We understood that because it was a hard thing. Just like what he said. Dennise, before you came on, he said they treat about 400 people and they go out, and we had done the same thing. So we knew that there was a lot more that had to be done, but we wanted to start it. And we were confident because of the penalties and all of that, that people were going to come in on their own account and say, listen, I own this property. And yet I see that the minister made a change amendment to the act, which said that it's only when they've done up to 50% of evaluation of, and he didn't distinguish between the properties, can they send that rule, that valuation rule, to Board of Inland Revenue, and it's there where the taxing is going to be done.
Yeah.
Why 50%? Why the 50%? Why was that necessary? I mean, I'm just asking your opinion because
Well,
I couldn't understand it really.
Well, what I found curious, I mean, they have to start somewhere, and I agree that we cannot wait till you get 100% of properties, but it does create some degree of inequity in the system if you only have half of the taxable properties being assessed, and it going forward, because then you'd have a substantial amount of people not paying. And what is ironic is that the persons who are paying are the ones who did the diligent thing to submit the return. So imagine you did the right thing, the quote unquote right thing to submit the return, and you are being assessed and taxed. And persons who were quote unquote delinquent and said, no, I'm not sending in any return, and they are not for part of the assessment role, they are not paying. So it seems, at least in the initial stages, that it's not fair. What I heard from a video done with an attorney in BIR was that as the assessment date is January 1st, 2024, then that's the official start of the rule. So which would mean that anybody who comes onto the roll later on, right, because they did not submit the return and they were caught, or they had to do a property transaction which will force them to be on the roll, like to sell the property or inherit it or whatever, they will be paying taxes effective as at the start date, which is January 2024. So if they come on the roll in 2030, they would have to pay from 2024, go forward to whenever that is. What I found curious about that amendment was that it said 50% of any type of property, which would mean that they could do 50% of what they consider would be the total number of agricultural properties and start the roll on residential, which I don't understand if that made any sense.
But no, you see, you answer my question as to why we felt we could have started it.
Mhm.
Because for the very same reason that you just gave is why we felt confident that we knew we did not have we knew we did not have a lot of the properties because people were not they were not being helpful, about the whole thing. But we knew, just like what you just said, that when we started sending out those bills and you saw the penalty for not sending in the return and the penalty for not declaring your ownership, you were going to pay a significant price and you're going to pay backwards. If you didn't do it for 5 years, we were going to go back 5 years plus interest. So we were confident that it may take us 5 years to get it all together. But we were confident that once people saw that the government was sending out these bills and they were serious about it, that they would recognize, I better go and let them know about my property, because when they catch up on me, it's not only for that year I will have to pay, I will have to pay for every year prior to the date on which they brought the act into effect. So it's the same argument. So I don't understand the magic of 50%. The magic was get it started. And once you got it started, I could bet we felt very confident within a year or 2 years, we would have gotten most of the properties, that was residential properties, on, because we were going to catch you, because we were not going to stop sending out people out to do the work that which you said, I mean, there's a better way to do it, but we were still going to send them out. We were still going to do the work. So we were going to catch up on you. So it's better you come in and pay.
So what is the current status? Because just around March,
Yeah, what
there
is
was
the current?
a notice that it has been suspended, that the property tax payments have been suspended until further notice.
No,
So
that was an error, which the
that was
minister.
an error?
Yeah.
I
So
don't
the
understand.
the minister said he never authorized that.
Here's what I just don't understand. Somebody puts up a notice.
Yeah. So BIR officers of the revenue collection offices, the revenue collection offices of BIR, they got wind of a cabinet note. This is what I'm reading on the papers. It was on one of the newspapers.
Cover yourself, huh?
Yes, it was on one of the newspapers where they said that, where the minister had said that it was poor communication on the part of the cabinet note reaching the offices, and they thought, well, this does not make any sense. Let's stop collection, because remember, they changed the rate. They changed the rate from 3% to 2%. So it should mean that people paying would be paying the wrong amount and then will have to get refunded. So that's why they took it upon themselves, from what the minister is saying, that to put up this notice and halt payments. But the minister said in no uncertain terms that that was wrong and it was not authorized. He did not give consent to do that. And property tax has not been suspended. Now, the Act gave BIR a deadline of March 31st to issue an assessment notice. And there's a reason for this. It was always the intention, and Karen, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. It was always the intention to give property owners a minimum of 6 months to pay. So they will get the assessment notice by the end of March, and you have until the end of September to pay.
That's correct. But that's also in the old acts, huh?
Yeah.
So it's not something we didn't know. If you went to land and building, and then you would find they had a similar provision. Huh?
Yeah. So now they have extended their own deadlines and said they can submit the assessments to property owners up until the end of June. But there's no statement about extending the payment deadline. So how can you extend your own deadline, but not the deadline for the population? And one thing I found particularly troublesome, right? And I don't know if you've read it, But there was also another amendment. And the wording for that was the most absurd thing I have ever seen, which is that the state can change any deadline they want at any point in time and it will be considered valid. So
Yeah,
if
I'm sure I didn't see it, but the minister did give instructions that when they reach the 50%, then they could send it over, and he will be able to decide
yeah.
when to ring the bell.
but
So
but this is in the recent weeks. So this happened
yeah,
about
but that is consistent with
yeah,
his conduct. That's what I'm
yeah.
trying to tell you. It is consistent with his using absolute discretion on himself. So after you give him his 50%, he says when you give him the 50%, he will then give an order to ring the bell, essentially, to start the payment of taxes. So the
Yeah.
50% is not the cut thing. It is
But
when he
legislative deadlines are there for a reason. It creates an obligation on the part of the citizen and an obligation on the part of the state. So it can't be that on one hand, we are holding the citizens to task to meet their obligations under the Act and meet their deadlines, but the state can, at whim and fancy, change their own deadlines and it will be valid under the law. I thought that was it was not what good governance is.
And it's
Good
not
governance.
only that, it's the public inspection. You had the right under the land and building, you had it under the house rates. I went and I got a copy of the old municipal, they had that part of the legislation had been repealed. And so the house rates, they told you every 50 year you could go and inspect the books. I have and you are saying there's a simple way of doing it, and you have to ask yourself, where is the transparency, Dennise? I mean, these things are very worrisome. And another thing with the valuation tribunal, if you are going to say in the amendment to the act, they then say, look, if you don't like what the commissioner decides after you appeal his decision, you would have to go to the tax appeal board. But they say no longer we're going to set up a valuation tribunal. Have they set it up? How are they? But if you haven't set it up, how are you implementing it? And then the other thing is the Local Government Act. It clearly provides that the local government authorities will be the ones who will collect the residential tax. And yet that legislation has not been passed. It is such a mishmash of confusion, a ball of confusion. And I think we as citizens are taking too much nonsense from this government, that they just can do what they want one day and do nothing. And then you do as I say, or else we will use that big stick. It's got to be fair play on both sides.
But
You know,
Karen, let me ask a question. This from
ask Dr. Lalu, huh?
no, this not for Dr. Lalu to answer. This for you to answer.
Oh God.
Who stopped the land and buildings taxes?
Mr. Manning, when
I mean, you and Mr. Manning.
when I had bills already to send out, because I was ready. I had the bills ready to send out. We would do it like how TNTech bills.
Yes.
We had TNTech bills, and we had also computerized the system. So you remember when you had land, like we shut down. I know you didn't ask me this, but I'm answering for the benefit of the audience too. We used to have a office in Toku. I said, you imagine I own a piece of land in Togo for holiday purposes, but I live in Point Bourton. I have to drive with gas all the way down to Togo to pay how much? $30, because the tax was negligible, right? So we abolished that and we tried to reform, which is what the focus was, reforming, so that you would have everything computerized. So no matter where you owned land in the country, you could go into any of the revenue offices and pay it. And we had reached a point where we felt you could pay like how you paid your TNTech bill and how you paid your WASA bill. We were going to send out bills for you to be able to pay. You were going to be able to pay in different, really modernize it. And the bills were ready to send out. And Mr. Manning called elections. And Mr. Manning called the elections and he gave me instructions. I'll be honest, I was ready for May. I was going to send it out in May. And he said, stop it, hold it back. Let's wait till after elections. And that's what stopped it. But as far as being ready to do it, and I want to ask Dr. Lalu this, because maybe I had a wrong understanding. And Dennise, you can chime in, please. Maybe I had a wrong understanding and I was the minister dealing with it. I always felt that when it came to the property tax in particular, my understanding was not so much like how you'd go after stamp duty, where you're really going after revenue, paying the proper stamp duty. You really were going after the revenue. My understanding was that you wanted to reform the whole tax system. You wanted to make it equitable. You didn't want part of the country paying under the land and building, other part paying on the municipal corporation, paying the municipal corporations charging between 2% and 10%. But in Port of Spain, they never did a valuation till 1975 was the last time, and they charging 10%. And then it go in San Fernando, and San Fernando paid 8%, but they did a valuation in 2008. It was so unfair. There was so much inequity in this board, in having these two pieces of legislation, and the fact that the tax was not the same across the board, depending on the category of land to which you fell. So my view of the thing, which may answer in a way what Dr. Lalu is saying, that you getting all these discrepancies. I think the thinking at the time was not so much to use it as a revenue base, as much as, because at that point in time we were in a good, even though they had the 2008 financial crisis, we had a fiscal surplus the year before, and the economy, if you look at all the macroeconomic indicators, we were in a fairly good position. And oil and gas was going to recover. That's how we felt. We said, methane, urea, everything was going to recover. It goes down, it goes up. So the focus really was not on, which is really what I'm trying to say, is not so much at getting it precisely right, as much as saying what it was trying to create transparency and equity in a little country where you had two systems operating side by side with different levels of taxations, different years of valuation, that was just and having to use these big heavy books to go and pay your land taxes in San Fernando, and you live in Port of Spain, to get rid of all of that. And the collection of the tax was really, in my view, as how I understood it, secondary to that primary purpose. Now, I think the property tax is no longer, I think the primary purpose now has really become revenue. And in fact, my final point on that was, even when we had the debate in Parliament, I never forgot it, because Dr. Rowley, who I had never had any argument with, and never had any disagreement with, at that point in time, he was a backbencher, and he did vote with the government. He didn't need his vote because he needed a simple majority in any case, but he did vote with the government. I can recall, and I was shocked, that he said, "Why you keep fooling the people? Why you feel fooling people? You are doing this because you need the money." And maybe I was naive or whatever, but my instructions were never to go and take a hardball look at property values, as much as to start the reform system in place, and eventually we would get it right. It might take a few years, but it would get it right. So I'm trying to say, maybe one of the reasons why this sort of approach to the valuation of properties was not done in the way you have said, which is an easier way, may have been, well, that was what the consultants recommended. So I will say that. I'll throw them under the thing, because I had to rely on their thing. But it was not so much about that, but more about creating equity across the board, transparency across the board, and to start people in the habit of paying a property tax that was fair across the nation. Because San Fernando, would you believe, I have the documents here, San Fernando was paying at 8% because that's what their corporation decided at 8%, but they had gotten valuations done and maybe in 2007, 2008, when the Property Tax Act, if it had been implemented in 2009, do you know they would have got paid less taxes under the Property Tax Act because their properties had been recently valued and they were paying it at 8%. So we felt that we would bring it down to the 3%. Port of Spain that was paying 90. Imagine you living in St. Clair and Ellerslie Park and in these neighborhoods, outlying neighborhoods, and you paying a 10% on valuations of 1975. So it was, to me, the focus really was in trying to remove the inequity in the system, create transparency and accountability rather than revenue collection, which it definitely is today. So that may have accounted for the approach that we took at the time, believing at the end of the day that we would get it right and that we would then be able to take a second look at the property tax, and perhaps it would then be more important for revenue collection as it was not seen at the time.
Dr. Lalu, when you reflect on the countries that you can compare Trinidad with, what is the thinking behind property tax? Is it revenue generation, or is it to ensure that there's a little more equity in societies?
I think it's revenue generation to make communities have some kind of fiscal autonomy. So it's really to give fiscal autonomy to local government authorities so that communities can develop and continue to be maintained as standard regardless of the sitting government or change in administration, that they would have that revenue base there. We have a system that, well, the new property tax system from 2009, which is designed on a first world type thinking, similar to something like, let's say, Barbados. The other countries, Jamaica, Grenada, St. Kitts, Antigua, they all have much older systems and their taxes are a lot lower. So ours is a little bit on the high side for the Caribbean, not as high as Barbados, right? Barbados is a lot higher, but we are right under them. And I think the intention really was to give that fiscal autonomy to communities.
And to do that, it's really the borough councils and the regional corporations that would have the authority to transform those countries once they get the income. And the income come from the property tax.
Yes.
But
they should have been able to collect it themselves.
Exactly. Because in Trinidad, once it goes into that central fund, you don't know, there's no, I have not seen how any of the taxes you pay is related to any development or any improvement or anything that we've done. I don't think that there's that relationship that people can say, well, listen, I'm going to pay that tax because this is what I get. You know, so if you, Dr. Lalu, if you had the opportunity and we lived in a magic and you were able to do one thing about this property tax, what would it be?
Well, I would, and I'll probably get dragged for this, but I would start it immediately on a fixed rate basis, meaning that everybody pays a nominal fee of, say, $100 a year, $200 a year, whatever the case is. And that way we have a start. And you give people the opportunity to submit their information, and we can declare a start date for the tax to be based on a value-based system. And so people can then take the initiative to say, well, I don't want to be paying the $100. I want to be paying it based on my value, because I don't want 10 years down when I eventually get onto the value-based system, I have to pay this retroactive high amount. So I would have started it immediately, because we have had a big disadvantage in the fact that nothing has been paid for the last how long has that been? Like almost a decade, right? So we've had no tax being collected. And you're taking people from paying nothing to paying a couple $1,000s a year is something that people would not have budgeted for. You know? So I think we would have been better served if to 2010, 2011, there was a fixed rate system which gradually increased. People were accustomed paying something, and then a little more and a little more and a little more until, right? But taking people from nothing when they're accustomed paying nothing, right? The Prime Minister had said in response to someone who criticized property tax the other day that we have benefited from having paid 0% property tax for the last how much ever years. And whereas that is true, the statement needs to be understood in context, in that whose fault is that? That is not the fault of the taxpayer. That is the fault of the state. So we cannot take blame for the fact that the state was unable to roll out their own taxation system. That's not our fault. The government did not benevolently give us a 0% rate, right? They were incompetent at rolling out the tax. That's a fact, right? So it isn't that we were generously given a 0% rate by the Manning administration, by the partnership, by the Rowley. That was not the case. It was not the case where taxpayers were given a 0% rate. It's simply that the government could not roll it out. And up to now, I mean, they have started it, right? The finance minister said they have received 801 payments totaling just over a million TT, right? So it started, but at the same time, we are now in a position where they're extending their own deadlines to give out assessments, because up to now they still have not figured this out.
Can I ask you something? You said two things, which I think actually a really good point. I've heard that point before. Get at a flat rate, because you haven't worked it out. People haven't paid taxes for so many years, and the economy is in a difficult situation. And to go from 0 to 1,000 when people are struggling is really difficult. And it's not 2009; it's a different ballgame. But laws are not usually retroactive, so I don't think you will run the risk that if you put the $100, that they'll come in 10 years down the line and go retroactive. It's very difficult to make a law retroactive. You need a special majority, and it's I don't think that would happen. What I think was what you said, I don't know if Dennise was here when you said it. Yeah, I think you were here. You said what they do in, there's a simple way to do it. There's a simple way to do the taxes by using the sale of properties, and get rid of this whole expenditure. In other words, start with the $100 and get people accustomed, because it's hard to ask people to go from 0 to hero, or 0 to whatever, to wherever they're putting us. It's hard for people to do that, especially in these times, and it really is a difficult time. But also, you've come up with a simpler method, and I would like you to reiterate it so that we could all understand it, because you said your Institute of Chartered Surveyors have a paper as to how it can be done in a more simple way than what is being done today.
Well, before we could say what's a simpler way, we need to know what's being done. We don't know. we don't.
But what would you recommend, if you could recommend, sister? Because
I would recommend that. Well, we are at a stage now where quite a considerable amount of data was collected. So I think let's run with that and see how it works. But I think that annual rental value is not an appropriate methodology for Trinidad and Tobago, because the basis of property transactions in the country is not rental, right? So it is much better to use a sale basis, because we have registered sale transactions that we could rely upon and say these properties sold for 1.2 million, 1.3 million, and that's a registered transaction. But rental value it will not stand to scrutiny. And I'm still waiting if and when the state does publicize the method in arriving at annual rental value. I do not think that will stand to scrutiny, because an easy question is, how did you arrive at that rate?
I'm going to read it out to you. I kept my document from back in the days, right? And so the heading is method of assessment. And they said there are two ways they could use the capital value and the rental value.
Capital value, sale value.
Right. Okay. And the reason why the rental value was chosen, they gave 3 reasons. So I'm just telling you, and then you could answer and say if it's a poppycock. I'm telling you, this is from the consultants, right? Yeah. Giving us advice. First, custom. One less thing to explain to a population accustomed to using rental values. Just telling you that. Evidence. There are areas where sales evidence is all but non-existent over long periods. Rented properties could be found in just about every village and community. Third reason, stability. Rental values tend to be more stable than capital values and lend itself to much slower changes than capital values. Those were the reasons that we were given to using the annual rental value than rather than the sales value for residential. That was the
Okay.
advice of the consultants.
But
But somehow, what do you think of that, though?
what I heard Dr. Lalu say is that the sales value is registered because that's a requirement. But and if your property is rented for less than 3 years, then there's no way of actually the government knowing that you have received rent for it. So to me, the sales value seems to have a system behind it as opposed to the rental value.
It's
But
evidence based.
the argument they've put is that so much of the country, Tobago, so much of the country, I'm giving you the argument that's
Yeah.
before. As I said, we live a lot of bedroom communities. People may live and work in the cities and so on, but people live outside, their homes are outside of those areas. And the argument certainly was in 2009 that whereas you would find that people were selling their properties in a lot of these communities, you always found persons renting. So it was easier to get a rental. That was the rationale, that you could easier be able, for evidential purposes, get a rental value as opposed to a sales value, because they were not so much of a turnover of properties in non-urban areas. And the last point was that they said that rental values, according to them, were more stable than capital or sales values. I don't know if that was the reason.
Well, they would have had their reasons why they said what they said. Let me just put something into context for you. COVID-19, and this is substantially after 2009, right?
Yes.
COVID-19 had an impact on the property markets, and the property market is more resilient than many other markets.
Yeah.
The major impact was on rentals.
That is true.
So if this was more stable, right, how is it that rentals were more...
You can't use COVID. COVID is, if you, I understand what you're saying, but COVID was a phenomenon that the world didn't expect. But I understand what you're saying. And you are right. Rental values collapsed, but rental values didn't only collapse because of COVID. Rental values collapsed because the foreign investment dried up. So a lot of people bought their houses in different communities, which I won't call, that they bought it as investments for their retirement or additional income, because there were so many foreign investment companies in the country that people were renting for US dollars.
Yeah.
When that dried up with the closure of Petrotrin and the whole problem with the natural gas and the whole problem with the foreign exchange, and we didn't come to talk about the economy, it is a fact, and it is in the economic bulletin of January of the central bank, that there has been significant decline in real estate rental values. There's no question that people can't get their places rented, and if they can get their places rented, they're certainly not getting it in US dollars. And if they're getting it rented, they're getting half of what they got when a few years ago. So,
but you see, valuation is an evidence-based profession.
right.
So we, being part of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, we sign every year an agreement that we could be audited, right?
Yeah.
And which would mean that we have to submit valuations to them for them to review whether we are keeping up a certain professional standard of ethics and all that. So as a professional valuer, for me to make sure that I cover myself adequately, any opinion of value that I have, if I say this property will sell for $20 million, I must have verifiable transaction activity to back that up.
Yes.
Right? Verifiable, and by verifiable, I mean a deed that was registered.
Yes.
Right? Something that says this is a sale that is in the public domain, that is publicly accessible. That's not the case for rentals. Residential rentals are not registered, so there's no way to tell. And even if you go on the internet and look for apartments for rent, that is
Yeah.
offer prices. That is not what is actually being rented for. Anybody can call any amount for their property. So that is not verifiable transaction evidence.
Right. Okay,
So
so
are you saying,
you throw away the argument, Dennise.
but I just want some clarification. So are you saying then that you can put on the internet or put in a newspaper any figure that you will rent your property for, but the actual rental is not necessarily that, because the actual rental is a private arrangement between you and the person who's renting.
Absolutely.
So then how is the government going to use?
That is what I would love to know. That's what I would love to know, because what the verifiable transaction would be the lease. When a landlord gets a tenant and they have a rental agreement or a lease, and the landlord signed and the tenant signed, and for this at $3,000 a month, that is a transaction, right? But something being advertised on the internet, on one of those real estate websites, that is not evidence of transaction activity.
But after you've signed the agreement, do you have to register? You said you had to register
The legal
more than 3 years.
Yeah, the legal requirement is leases over 3 years must be registered. But anything under 3 years in writing is adequate. It doesn't have to be registered.
So it doesn't mean that have written leases.
For the property tax.
Yeah.
If rental is going to be the preferred strategy, then we need to have some system to support it so that you have the data. And you talked about the verifiable data. And the only way you get verifiable data is you need to have the system, the structure, and the process in place. And you must have people adhering to it.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that my point of view of our country is that the system, structures, and processes have collapsed. So there are very few instances, and you will probably tell me no, but there are few instances in which people honor that people do what they're supposed to do, because the thing has collapsed entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I will say though this, in relation to your point, Dr. Lalo, and what you're saying, the reality is that whilst a lease of 3 years or more has to be registered, that is true, but most people who rent want a contract, and that contract is a lease.
Mm-hmm.
They want it in writing because they want to protect themselves. If you do damage to my property, who's responsible for this, who's responsible for that, and what it is. And if you make the mistake of saying to valuation that you are renting your property for $3,000, you never know. First of all, they have information that you don't know what information they have. They have information on your neighbor, right? So they have a good idea of what renters are going for in that area or that townhouse or that apartment. All they will ask you to bring in your lease.
Mm-hmm.
And you taking a real risk. You're taking a real risk to say that you get in 3,000, and when you bring in the lease, you get in 10,000.
Yeah.
So that is not something. So in a way, the same way you talk about sales being evidential, a sale is evidential. At least when people rent, and people rent, they want something in writing, because at the end of the day, they want protection to be able to throw out the tenant. They want protection for when the tenant destroys their property. They want protection. And so there's something in writing. And if you
But I don't know if the state has the ability to mandate anybody to give a copy of their lease. Through what mechanism would they really do so?
Well,
I wouldn't do it.
Well, I must be foolish, because I say to myself, I must be foolish. I said, you know what? Maybe I'm overly sensitive about it. But the fact of the matter is, I said, guess what? If I say one thing and they look at it and they say, well, let's just see what your lease is, or what your lease looks like. I don't know if they can't ask you to see your lease. Why can't they ask to see the lease?
They can ask, but the question is whether they can demand.
Okay, so you don't want to show me a lease, well, we'll decide what your rent is. Since you don't want to show us it, we are going to make an assessment of your property, and your property cannot be rented.
I'm gonna get a question in here before we continue. We are running out of time. I'm hearing about residential, I'm hearing about commercial, industrial, and agriculture, and all of that. How does the process affect people who do business in the same place that they live? You know, there are some places where people have a business downstairs or upstairs. They live either upstairs or downstairs. How do the valuation process refer to that?
Well, it's based on actual use. So if you own a property, let's say it's a residence, and you're using part of it for commercial, then that part would be assessed for commercial purposes, and you'd be paying a commercial property tax on that segment of it. So they will apportion it. If 50% of your house is being used for commercial purposes, that will be assessed for commercial property tax at the commercial rate, which is 5%, and the other 50% will be residential property tax, which will be 2%. So they will work it out as two different units.
Okay. So if it's a 75-25% sort of occupancy, like you're living in a just a room of the building, and 75% is commercial.
It'll be mainly commercial. But as I said before, mixed-use buildings aren't being captured in this rollout.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
You know, Dr. Lalu, when you said that the mixed use building is not being captured, that again has me so confused that we're talking about changing things, we're talking about redesigning, we're talking about upgrading and so on. And now you've come to the property tax issue. And every time I pass a building that I see is a mixed use building, they are not on the arena at all. Then what you're doing there, I think, is unfair to most people. Because you can just drive around and see the mixed-use properties. There are lots of them
along all major roads. Right?
Yeah,
all major roads.
That is very true, Dennise.
It even lends to the thought process of areas that are considered rural. But in those areas along a main road, you see a lot of those mixed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the Tesheira road going down from San Fernando to.
Yes, very good example.
That whole road.
He knows that, he's from South. David's from South.
That is not urban.
I live in Diego Martin, and along the Diego Martin main road, I could point out mixed-use buildings, commercial property. You go through central Trinidad and you see those mixed-use buildings. They're all the time, So it's a very unfortunate thing. But David said that we're coming to the end. We're running out of time. So, Dr. Lalu, if you had to identify a couple of points that you think you'd like people to hold on to as the things that you commented on, what would those points be?
I would say that the objection process is important.
Yes.
So many people would be disagreeing with the assessment. Submit your objection. That's important. And now the state the minister has indicated they're extending the time to 6 months. So that 6 months would not have run out for anybody. So which would mean that everybody can still submit an objection. The commissioner has a year to respond, but it's on the basis of comply and complain, which means that you have to pay it until you wait for that. My concern with that is people who have multiple assessments on the same property, right? Which there was a case of duplication, several cases where people received 2 and 3 assessments for their one property. And the question is, which do you pay? Do you pay one of them? Do you pay all of them? All right. So that's a question that they need to address immediately. You can't expect a person to pay 3 assessments in error and then wait for a refund. That's not fair. All right.
So your recommendations, following what Dennise asked you, what would you recommend that people file the objections?
File the objection if you are in disagreement with the thing. If you think it's too low, leave it alone. Leave it alone. I would squarely ignore that.
We agree with you.
Go quietly and pay your taxes and be a diligent citizen.
And the public inspection point. What about the public inspection point?
I think that we need to keep insisting at all levels in any interaction we have with the states that information is available to the public. So we
Yeah.
need to know how they are valuing properties. If they are willing to stand up to it and to say this is a legitimate method that is evidence based, then tell us what you're doing. That's one.
I was talking about the right to see what other properties
And
are.
we need the assessment role to be public.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's your three recommendations. And
Yes.
I had told us, I'm going to let you have the last one, but I told Dennise and we ran out of time. I tell Dennise, we ran out of time and we have one guest, The thing is, the low hanging fruit is the revenue authority because we know there's a leakage of about $5 billion from between the Board of Inland Revenue and Customs that collect over 90% of our taxes. They're passed the law. Why haven't you done what is done? Why don't you put the effort into collecting that $5 billion? Why don't you put the effort into the gambling commission where you're telling all these suspicious transactions, many of which are connected to the gambling in Trinidad? To me, it seems to me that it gives the impression that, well, let's just
That we're
say,
just continuing to punish diligent taxpayers.
I know not only diligent and indigent. Don't forget that word, diligent and indigent.
There's a lot of revenue that could be gained from just enforcing the existing taxes and the existing rules.
That's what I want to say. And Dennise, you wanted to finish?
I just wanted to ask Dr. Lalu one more question. This paper that you all are preparing, what is it? What are you all going to be doing with it?
It's going to be a press statement.
So you're preparing a paper and then you're going to make a press statement.
What's that said? You're not going to have what you call it, Dennise, you're the communication person.
No. What I would be interested in is they do their press statement, they deliver the paper to whoever is the person in authority, and then they deliver the paper to every member of parliament so that they see what your attitude is. And you also the press conference. So the press conference will be the announcement that this is the paper, these are the 5 points in the paper, and we've sent it to the Minister of Finance.
I guess what else to Dennise? And a town hall meeting.
I don't know about that.
But you see, our last,
I mean,
our last statement,
I don't mean a town hall meeting. I mean having a symposium or whatever you want to call it.
We did a very comprehensive review of the last amendment in 2018. And that was highly publicized. That almost every newspaper published it. It was on the news. They interviewed us. And all of those recommendations were just squarely ignored. None of it was taken into account. So,
there we are. Well,
there we are. Because, Karen, one of the reasons that I don't support, the town hall meetings and those kind of meetings is I passed by the Port of Spain town hall on the day the Constitution Committee was there.
Yeah.
And I tell you, if they had 40 people in there, and I think that seats about 300 people. If they had 40, they had a lot. I think we've lost our voices, and other things have to happen to stimulate us to get involved and to talk about things. I think people are just stooping, drinking water and minding their business.
Well, I do think there's a little difference with the constitutional reform because you need a 3/4 majority to make any constitutional reform. So a lot of people feel that they're good ideas, but they're really based in theory. But Margaret Thatcher lost her government over property tax. She lost her government over property because of the inequity. It's not the same, but the inequity. So we've had Section 34 marches. We've had people stand up and say something is wrong. What I will say is we've not to stop drinking the water. If something is wrong and something is unfair, we have to stand up and be counted. And I think the constitutional reform is a little different because it's a bit highbrow, number one. And secondly, you really need a three-quarters majority to ever have any reform in the Constitution. But this property tax touches every single one of us, and it is unfair. We've had Dr. Lalu. Thank you very much for joining us. You have been a wealth of information. I know one thing, Dennise, and I know I learned, but I know Dennise, thank you for asking the question about the mixed property.
Yeah.
That was really an eye-opener. And all of the recommendations you have made We really appreciate it. And we hope that when you do publish it, that we have a symposium and people do more than stops and drink water.
As we come to a close, Karen, do you want to announce who's our next speaker next week, Monday?
Well, and again, I am very, maybe a little too transparent, but Dennise and I will always talk, and we try to keep the conversation informative. And she had Marla Dukaran. I was not able to join, but one of the burning questions is the question of an informal economy. Why? Because Dennise kept asking me on the show before, but Karen, I seen so many cars. Why are you saying that? She kept asking me that question. And so Marla Dukaran was on. So we're having Dr. Darius Figueroa, who is well known in Trinidad. He's very happy to come on. And I think he's going to be able to answer some of the questions as why it is the central bank is telling us we live in paycheck to paycheck, right? They have 5.2 billion in foreign exchange, down from 6.8 a few months ago. And I could go on and on. And yet we have all of that, and there seem to be people who seem to have tremendous wealth in this country. So Dr. Darius Figueroa, well-known, maybe a little controversial, but I'm sure he's going to be informative, and we're looking forward to having him. And thank you, I can say, yes, for both of us, and Dennise.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Lalu.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we want you to do a symposium too, eh?
Thank you.
Yes. It's been a pleasure.
Have a good evening, everyone.
And good evening. Bye-bye. Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye. All right.
The future of talk is here. Power 102 Digital.
Well, that takes us to the end of today's edition of Hard Talk, Power 102 Digital Monday, with hosts Karen Nunez Tesheira and Dennise Demming. Our special guest, Dr. Sunil Lalu. Come tomorrow, we'll have another edition for you. News straight ahead.